Hello and welcome everyone back to the show. I'm so privileged to have an incredible guest, an award-winning film composer, TV composer, Mr. Hummie Mann. He's done so many incredible movies, and I think really, from my many different guests, word of mouth is probably one of the best endorsements. So let me read a quote, or at least a quote attributed to the great Jerry Goldsmith, who recommended Mann, saying, "He is a composer with a strong sense of melody and a genuine command of the orchestra." And Hummie, it's a real privilege to have you on the show today.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for asking me.
You've done some good interviews on your background where you talked about learning the recorder at school, learning guitar at summer camp, going to Berklee, and so maybe since it's been so well covered, I do want to talk about how you do what you do, which is so phenomenal. And I was actually blown away that in your dissertation in 2015, you laid it out. You kind of laid out kind of the missing way, a lot of the missing information that was out there in terms of learning how to score music for film. And let me read the title of your dissertation, which is "The Temporal and Rhythmic Effect on Musical Composition and Form When Scoring Dramatic Moving Pictures." And this is your thesis at the University of Salford in 2015. You wrote, "In my experience, I have found that there are a number of instructional texts that discuss many of the technical aspects of film composition, such as calculating timings and techniques of synchronization of music to film. However, I have found that there is very little information on the compositional technique of film scoring." So maybe we should start there.
Okay, well, one of the things that I discovered when I was doing my doctorate was I had to do a literature study, a literature review. And I was very excited when I found that there was supposedly a book by Ennio Morricone, brilliant composer.
Yep.
And it was actually more a transcription of some lectures that he had given, but nonetheless was still very interesting. The part of it that was kind of, disappointing was that he would talk about how a film composer very often has to take a four measure phrase in 4/4 and drop a beat in order to catch a timing requirement. But he doesn't talk about how to do it in terms of math. He talks about the mathematics of it, but he doesn't talk about the compositional. What is it that you can do to make sure that 3/4 bar or the 5/4 bar, whatever you need to do, add a beat, subtract a beat, that it doesn't sound like there's a speed bump in your music. And so I started codifying and teaching techniques that people can use for that kind of problem, which appears all the time in film scoring. You're not always very fortunate to write everything in 8-bar phrases. Sometimes you have to write 9-bar phrases or 11-bar phrases or 7-bar phrases. And how do you make that all sound natural? So I decided that the thesis was actually part of a few chapters of a textbook that I've been working on for years, to teach people how to do this stuff, to teach them actual techniques of film composition. So that's basically what my thesis talked about, some of it. But then I've been teaching a film scoring program that I created for the last for quite a few years, actually. It's been a master's degree for 12 years. And in that program, I've been developing materials and teaching all these techniques that I was codifying and writing about for years and years and years. And that became, parts of that became academicized and became part of my thesis. So the thesis was actually all about techniques of film composition also.
If you have somebody who has never scored for film before, and I'm sure you get students who have some kind of, perhaps they've written music, but they've never written for film. So immediately, what's the first paradigm of film composition that somebody who wants to jump into it, what must they immediately have framework when they're thinking of scoring for films?
Well, it's very interesting. That's a very big question. The methodology that we teach, the first thing that we cover are different harmonic systems. Harmonic systems, diatonic chords, which are all based on the same scale. Secondary dominant chords, which are pretty common in classical music. And then we talk about things like modal interchange chords, where you're borrowing chords from parallel modes. And then we talk about tonal systems, things like what I call chromatic voice leading, but some people call median chord progressions, like going from C minor to E minor. Those
Right.
two chords have no tonal relationship to each other. The reason I don't call it median chord progressions is that you can go from C minor to F sharp minor by the same system if you understand how it works. And we talk about how to create dissonance, how to create two different kinds of dissonances, rich dissonances and harsh dissonances. Harsh dissonances might be when somebody's walking along and something bad happens immediately and you need to go into a harsh dissonance. So how to do those things, how to control those elements. So we break down all the individual tools that a composer might need when they're working on a film score. So, somebody walking alone in a garage and all of a sudden hears something, and so there's a creepy sound. Well, it should be followed by a creepy chord.
Right.
You're not going to get it by going to a diminished chord, because those are kind of dated way of doing it. But how do I get a nasty sounding chord, and what kinds of structures do I use? So it's basically teaching a set of tools that you can use in film scoring, and then also along the same time starting to talk about the idea of timings. Your music doesn't get to play musical form; it has to play dramatic form. And so you might have a great theme, but you have to make it 9 bars sometimes, and sometimes it's 6 bars, and sometimes it's 3 bars. And how do you do that without alerting the audience that you're dropping beats or dropping parts of the phrase? So we teach techniques that I don't want to say I developed them, but I've certainly codified them more than anybody else has that I can find. I mean, and part of the thing that started me on this journey, amongst other things, was being on a chat group online. I think it was one of the software companies, Northern. I'm spacing out on the name of the company, but there was a chat talking about somebody was looking for a book on film scoring, and everybody agreed that there was books, but there's nothing that really gives you technique of film scoring. And so that was the thing that I decided that there's a void there that I'd like to fill, and became the basis of all the teaching and all the master's program that has been going on for, like I said, for 12 years.
I have a question. Since we started talking about the harmonic framework. I'm very curious about, because I understand you were a graduate of Berklee, and jazz musicians, and I'm sure Berklee is quite broad in terms of contemporary music, but chord symbols and chord terminology, the chord symbol with its various qualities, how is that similar to perhaps classical composition with counterpoint? Does counterpoint, for instance, because I think in some ways there's two schools of, I know like some of these older school people, maybe they might not have thought in terms of chord symbols, but is it just a different language for the same thing?
Well, I don't want to speak for every composer. I mean, my feeling is when I'm teaching something, if I teach someone a technique that sounds like something that John Williams does, so that you can recreate that sound or recreate that, see how it falls under a technique that I've taught you. I don't care that John Williams thought about it that way. But I would say it's interesting because there's not a lot of strict counterpoint in film music. There's a lot of counter lines, which is kind of based on film score and on classical thing. But true counterpoint, the moving lines would define the harmonic language, what harmonies are happening. Whereas in contemporary writing, we usually have a melody and a texture, and the texture's job is to give propulsion to the piece and also to define what the chords are, that are the harmonic language. I mean, it's interestingly, if you think about Star Wars, the first chord in Star Wars is C major. The second chord is G minor 7/11, going back to C major. Well, G minor 7/11 is not a diatonic chord. It's a modal interchange chord. It's a 5 minor chord. So in a lot of cases, when I listen to John Williams' music, I can identify that he's using modal interchange to create a lot of his harmonic language.
Right.
So,
Right.
the net result of it is that, in my opinion, contemporary film scoring uses a lot more, uses harmonic language that's much more based on jazz chords than it is on classical music. When you think about classical music, at least a lot of the teaching is they teach diatonic chords, they teach secondary dominance, then they have the French, German, and Italian 6 chords, minor 6 chords.
Right.
But But a lot of the chords, like, if you're in the key of C and you go to an E flat major 7 or an E flat major chord,
Yeah.
that doesn't fit into anybody's mold.
Yeah.
So, or C to D flat, then going back to C. So a lot of that has been, codified in jazz education, but has not been codified in classical education.
Right.
Because a lot of the classical music doesn't do that. Although a lot of more contemporary classical musicians that are doing extended tonality music are actually using some of these concepts now. I usually find that there's some controlling factor, some unifying system that makes most of this music work. I've yet to be baffled by, like, well, gee, where's that chord come from? I mean, and sometimes it's just a direct modulation. You played something in one key and then you go to another key. And sometimes those can be very refreshing and very exciting. I mean, I've done that. But pretty much, if you write 1 4 5 1, you're going to define a key. If you go 1 flat 3 flat 7 1, you're also going to define a key.
Right.
And one is all diatonic and one is 2 modal interchange chords. So, there's something else going on that a lot of classically trained composers haven't experienced.
Right. Now to ask you about orchestration and how did you learn orchestration and how did you learn to be so good at orchestration? And what was your introduction to the orchestra? Because I read here that you learned a bunch of instruments, but when did you take it to the next level?
I mean, I was very fortunate when I got to Hollywood that I had enough theoretical background, but I didn't have as much hands-on experience. But I got to work on television shows for every week for 6 or 7 years. And in those days, we would have anywhere between a 25 to a 40-piece orchestra. So you get to try a lot of things. You don't want to take baby steps into spreading your wings, but you figure out how to balance the orchestra. You figure out how to combine instruments. I mean, I think that one of the things that's interesting that kind of sometimes gets glossed over is the fact that, one of the things that they don't teach in classical training and that we do teach in jazz training and also in my film scoring class is the idea of voicings, of how to voice chords. Whether they're all chord tones or you're adding in some richness tones or some tensions, as they're called. And also, there's a whole technique where you consider the intervals that are in a voicing. So, if you have seconds and fourths, it's going to sound much hipper than if it's all thirds. Right. I mean, that's a major oversimplification of the concept. But the idea is you can make something sound very different by the way you pile the notes up. Instead of piling everything in thirds, if you put seconds in there, you end up with a much more interesting voicing. So I think that that's something that you learn in jazz writing. If you're learning to write for big band, you talk about voicings all the time. But that same principle can also be applied to classical music or film music. I mean, like I was saying, in Star Wars, the second chord is a G minor 7/11, which it means that there's a 4 in the voicing, there's a flat 7 in the voicing, So that is definitely not a classically derived chord or a classically derived voicing. I mean, the other thing is that classical music is predominantly triadic. I mean, the thing that people think of it as, I mean, there are exceptions to this rule. I mean, it's kind of hard to make blanket statements like that. But in contemporary writing, we take a lot more advantage of the theories of voicings. You create your chord progression, and then you decide how to color the chord progression depending upon the voicing that you create. And then you get to activate that voicing, and that becomes what we call a texture. At least that's the way we teach it. Where you're moving things. It could just be an arpeggiation of a chord. It can be certain notes playing together, pyramiding together. So there's all kinds of techniques of activating a chord once you have this. So it's basically choose your progression, choose your voicings, create your texture.
Did you? Go ahead.
And I was going to say, most film music is melody and texture. There's not that much counterpoint. Sometimes there's a counterline, but more of the time it's just melody and texture. And maybe you'll harmonize the melody in thirds or sixths or something of that sort, and there'll still be texture. So,
did you use any orchestration books, or did you use your Berklee books to study orchestration, or were you really just thrown into the swimming pool and kind of had to? Did you look at? I know you worked with Alf Clausen early on, and you worked on The Simpsons and many great TV shows. Where did you need some points of reference, or was it just experimentation?
No, there's definitely some points of reference. I mean, if you have a 5-note chord and you have the right numbers of strings in your section, it'll balance out. If you have 5 brass players, it'll balance out. It gets a little trickier with woodwinds because they have different timbres that sound great together, but if you need to balance them, you need to play things in certain ranges in order to make it work. So I think that some of it was me taking some classes, and I took a class at UCLA Extension taught by Don Ray years ago, and we got to write for an orchestra every week, and so I got more experience, and that was before I was actually working in the industry and doing it on a weekly basis. Right. But certainly, the idea is like, if you're trying to learn how to play piano and you don't have a piano at home, it's going to be hard to practice. Yep. And the same thing with orchestration. And the problem that we have nowadays is that mockups or electronic emulation can really be deceiving because it doesn't blend the same way that an orchestra blends. Even though you might have all great samples and all of that stuff, if the samples are played at different velocities, that can mess up your balances. There was something that I heard the other day that had a big string section and then a very low flute, going down to the bottom fifth of the instrument, which would never be heard in a real acoustic situation. But right. You stick a microphone up the flute player's, right into the flute player's face, you're going to hear it. But it's a pretty natural, it's a pretty major distortion of how an orchestra balances.
Right. How should a young person? I guess it's a bit more difficult now, but how should a young person or a new composer or somebody who's trying to get into orchestration and getting used to the orchestral timbres, if they're so used to samples and VSTs, because that's very popular now and people buy these VST packs and they're quite realistic sounding, but how would you get that practical information? And what is the difference? Because you're an experienced composer. What is the you mentioned some of them, but what are the further drawbacks of just being a pure electronic composer with no experience with the real world?
Well, most people, a lot of my students, and in fact, I even did this for a while when I was still orchestrating for people. You're working with people who are doing mock-ups to play for the directors, and so their goal is making their mock-up sound as good as possible. And then it's up to the orchestrator, an experienced orchestrator, to figure out how is this going to balance with an orchestra, or do I need to make some changes that are not going to change the intent of the music, but are going to actually make them work. A really simple example is, years ago I orchestrated for a composer who will remain nameless, who had the 16th note arpeggiations over 2 octaves on the cello, going from regular position into thumb position and back and forth. It would have been absolutely impossible for somebody to play. But, because I was aware of that, I went, okay, well, we can pyramid those things. Sorry, we can dovetail those things. So you need to learn some of those techniques. When I was studying orchestration, it's actually an interesting question, because most of the orchestration books are really instrumentation books. Mm. They don't talk to you about how to voice woodwinds versus how to voice brass versus how to voice strings, what you take advantage of. And so it's really kind of difficult to get that information. I think I said earlier, I'm working on a book, and some of the concepts will be in the book. So I'm hoping to fill a gap. There's a lot of information that is not available that I've been able to find anyway.
There's so much I want to get to, and I might have to jump around because I've got a bunch of questions here. There's just so many interesting things. There's an anecdote that I found really interesting. So you were working with the composer James Newton Howard on the film Dying Young. And I found this very fascinating, where you took a theme and you doubled the bassoon to change or add to the color. And that resulted in the composer liking it and that affecting the way that orchestration arrangement really changed the whole dynamic of it, because he liked it so much. And that's an example of you changing the color and using your experience as an orchestrator. How do you learn that, and how do you get better at being able to spot those things? And
my philosophy about orchestration is this: it shouldn't just be somebody who, in the old days we used to have sketches and we would just transfer it to big paper sometimes. And then, nowadays it's transcription and just play whatever the composer asked for. There's a lot of a lot of reasons why not to do all of those things, and I'll get into those afterwards. But the rule for me as an orchestrator is I want to bring something to the party. And so I have the time and the luxury of having a little more time to kind of sit back and look at the cue and go, what could be put in here to enhance something? The rule is that it has to be removable with one easy command. So if James Newton Howard had heard that piece with the bassoon and didn't like it, he could have said, bassoon, tacit bars 2 through 6. I don't want the bassoon in there. And he would have gotten exactly back what he had given me. And that happens sometimes. I also orchestrated the main title for Star Trek Voyager and for Jerry Goldsmith, and I did a similar thing with that. In the piece, there's a timpani solo, and I decided to double that with pizzicato basses to give it a little bit more pitch definition. And when he got to the stage, he conducted it, and he turned to the bass and says, "Basses, tacit bars 2 to 6. I just want to have the timpani solo." And so it was no problem. And after the experience, he took me out to lunch, and we were eating lunch, and he said, it was a cool idea you had, but I really just want a timpani solo. And I said, "Hey, Jerry, that's fine. My job is to give you options that you may not have considered when you were writing it. But my ego isn't bruised if you don't use it."
Right.
And at the end of that lunch, he asked me to become his orchestrator, which at that point in my career, I wasn't really interested in orchestration work anymore. So, I turned down Jerry Goldsmith as an orchestrator, which probably stupid, but he understood. I mean, he had already called me on a couple of occasions to come in and work with him as an assistant composer, or on one film he wanted to write the themes and wanted me to do the score, and for political reasons it didn't work out. The producers refused to give me the credit that Jerry wanted me to have, so Jerry walked off the job. So pretty amazing gig.
Sounds pretty cutthroat, the way that sometimes Hollywood can be, and producers just wanting celebrity on the poster. But I mean, it just is a testament to your skill that Jerry Goldsmith really liked your work, and it mentioned you have to share this anecdote about him liking your music to Robin Hood Men in Tights, because it's a great anecdote.
Right. Well, one day my agent called me up and said, and Jerry and I shared the same agent at that point, said, "Hummie, I meant to tell you the first time Jerry said it, but he said it again at lunch today, how impressed he was with your work to Robin Hood Men in Tights." And I went, "Wait, Jerry Goldsmith even knows who I am?" I mean, I was just blown away. Jerry, this is, one of the gods as far as I'm concerned. And my agent said, "Well, you should call him up." And I said, "Okay." So I get on the phone and I call Jerry's office. He gives me Jerry's office number, and I get Jerry's assistant, Lois. And I'm kind of making small talk. She says, "Well, he just walked into the main house. He'll be back very shortly." So I'm making small talk with Lois and feeling very uncomfortable because I'm calling Jerry Goldsmith. And I said to Lois, "Well, listen, I was just calling Jerry to thank him for some of the nice words he said about one of my scores." And Lois said, "He did what?" I said, "Well, he said some nice words about one of my scores." And she says, "Oh, that's weird, because Jerry never says anything nice about anybody's scores." I was going, "Hey, this is weird." Okay, where's the Twilight Zone stuff? Anyway, so I'm about to hang up, and Jerry walks back into the office and gets on the phone with me. And I had just been hired to do a 10-picture deal for Showtime, where I was going to score 10 different films. And Jerry spent the next hour or an hour plus on the phone with me, talking about all the directors that he had worked with that I was going to get to work with. And he said, "Well, told me a little bit about their idiosyncrasies and what to watch out for." And it was like, I was so blown away. I mean, just talking to Jerry was a thrill, and to be treated like a peer was even more amazing. Right. And the fact that he knew who I was, that would have been enough. So,
we missed something because we talked about Alf Clausen, and some purists think that the earliest seasons of The Simpsons are the greatest out of the entire series, and you worked on them. You worked on the early seasons of The Simpsons. I just wanted to, if you could just talk about what it was to work on that series, that groundbreaking series, and working with Alf Clausen, and what I know Danny Elfman wrote the theme, but then there's the rest of the music. So you talk about working on The Simpsons.
Yeah, the strange thing about The Simpsons was that it was a lot of very, very short cues. at the early seasons, Alf did not get to write the songs in the movie. You know, they had someone else writing the music for the songs, and and um, working with I guess in a lot of cases the writer of the script wrote the lyrics. I was not privy to that. I was not part of that part of the process. Um, but a lot of it was very short cues. I mean, we'd have 40 pieces of music, and it would total of 3 minutes of music. You know, and
Wow.
it was kind of it was kind of an odd gig that way. You know, and every now and then, you know, I would write a few cues for Alf if there was, so many starts, he just needed somebody else to do some stuff, which I had done for him on Moonlighting as well. We worked well together for many years, uh, and then I started working on feature films and just wasn't available to him as an orchestrator anymore. And a couple years I was orchestrating on feature films, doing things like City Slickers and Addams Family, and then eventually got my break to do Robin Hood Men in Tights. So
Right, right. Oh, there's so much to get into. And oh my goodness, we missed just a quick thing about meeting Charles Mingus and Clark Terry while you were a student at Berklee. We can't miss that.
yeah, I was because I am originally Canadian and I was working in the States. I had to have a work study program, so I had to only work on campus. And I was very fortunate to be the person who worked on the concerts and the guest artists that came to Berklee. So I actually, got to meet Charles Mingus and bring him to where he was working and answer any questions that he had, and then Clark Terry the same thing. So it was pretty cool, and getting to meet a lot of these legendary players.
At that time, did you know you were going to be working as a writer for film and media?
I knew I was going to be composing. I think that I kind of discovered film scoring. I mean, I was certainly familiar with it, but it wasn't the initial attraction to Berklee. I mean, because when I applied to Berklee, most of my experience had been as a singer-songwriter and also someone who played, I played piano in a jazz trio, although I'm not a jazz pianist per se, you know, and I wrote little bits of classical piano music. The thing that really attracted me to film scoring, which I became aware of probably more at Berklee, was the fact that I would get to write every single style of music under the sun. And that really excited me. The idea that one day I'd write a jazz score, the next day a rock score, and the next day a bluegrass score, and maybe a ragtime score, and maybe a classical gothic score, maybe a classical, maybe an ethnic type of bass score. I mean, that's the stuff that really, excites me in film scoring, is the idea that I can be this chameleon that chooses what kind of music is going to work for the film and without any limitations. So that's really one of the big things that I got out of Berklee. I mean, it's funny because when I was at Berklee, I did 1 year of electrical engineering at McGill University before
Yes.
going to Berklee, in between high school. And I wasn't unhappy because my second, I really enjoyed mathematics and physics, but my father noticed that I wasn't playing guitar or doing, which I used to play all the time. And I basically explained to him, I said, it's hard to come home from a day of classes, do an hour or two of physics and an hour or two of calculus, and then want to sit down and play the guitar. It's just difficult, And he saw that I was not very happy about that. And he said to me, well, if you apply to music school and you get in, I'll send you. And at the time, Berklee College of Music was not quite as selective as it became later on in its history. And so I got accepted, and that started my journey. And the thing that was interesting is that the one film scoring class I had at Berklee was all the mathematics for film, which nowadays we can do on computers.
Yeah.
But back then we had to do it with paper and pencil on a calculator. And I just felt like that's why I got out of electrical engineering. I didn't want to do this stuff. So why should I be doing it for film scoring? I mean, I respect the fact that it's an important part of the process, doing timings. But luckily now, between DAWs and before DAWs, there was a program called Oracle, which was used a lot in Hollywood. I mean, doing all the mathematical calculations for film music are much easier these days.
Right. You have one of the great lines in confidence in music before, like in high school. You said, if you like the Beatles, you'll like me.
I wasn't in high school. I was in grade school.
Grade school. Sorry. Yeah. That's one of the great lines.
Well, I used to try to explain what I did to the girls in the fifth grade when I was in fourth grade, or the sixth grade when I was in fifth grade. And it was like the Beatles were just becoming well known, and I consider myself a songwriter. I never
Yeah.
really made the connection of like, well, they're famous, great songwriters, and I'm
Yeah.
like nobody beginning songwriter. But yeah, that was pretty much
Pretty adorable, yeah, for a kid.
immature ego talking.
Very, very adorable for a kid. Now, you mentioned Berklee. This is interesting. Now, you said it was easy to get in, but there was a very high attrition rate. Something like 1,500 would go in, only like about 100 would leave, would graduate.
Yeah.
And
My
this
graduating class, which was the largest graduating class in the history of Berklee, was 120 students. And we started with 1,500, so it was like 10 to 1, 12, 11 to 1. Nowadays,
go ahead.
Nowadays they spend a lot more time on keeping people in the program. So they graduate a quarter of their class graduates, or pretty close to a quarter. The whole student body, but it didn't in those days.
Now I'm interested. You had a massive portfolio, something like 300 pages. You said you had big band charts, orchestral works, piano pieces, choral works. And so that must have been a lot of writing. Did you write at that scale? Or is that the first time in your life you were really writing and writing and writing?
Well, in order to graduate Berklee with a composition, so one of the things about Berklee is that I went there as a composition major, which meant that I had to fulfill all the requirements of a classical composition class. Right. So I was taking classes in, Bach chorales, how to analyze and write like Bach, species counterpoint, getting into 20th century works, right. Stockhausen and Webern and all the like. And at the same time, I was taking classes in writing in the style of Duke Ellington. So, but for my graduation portfolio, was all classical or contemporary classical. And so we had to write a choral piece in the 18th century, from the 18th century, and a choral piece in the 20th century. We had to have at least one fugue, and I think and then it was a variety of pieces. One was an orchestral work of a certain length, and one was a piano sonata of a certain length, with a classical form but could be contemporary language. So I had to write a lot of music, and I'd come home every day after class and sit and write music for about 2 or 3 hours just to get the portfolio requirements done. Right. It's funny, I still have that portfolio. Most of the music, unfortunately, never been performed.
Yep.
It's student music, so I'm not sure if it would sound very good, but it'd be interesting someday to pull it out, go dig up those files, and and then again, there weren't files in those days. It was all handwritten.
Wow.
It was all pen and paper.
Wow.
We didn't have Valley, we didn't have Sibelius, and you couldn't be figuring out if stuff was working by playing back anything. You had to actually sit at the keyboard and go, okay, that voicing, this works together.
Now, Hummie, you are old school in the sense that you're like John Williams. You seem to prefer to write your music pencil, paper, at the piano, and you only use the sequencer to demonstrate like a mock-up or like a demo. So to the modern composer or the modern music, how can you do that? You have all these technological marvels, but what is the advantage of writing with a pencil and paper and just having an instrument?
Well, I think the thing is that there are many things that you can do acoustically that don't work electronically, and vice versa, by the way. It's not a one-way street. But, my music editor used to have this great idea. He said, make a Venn diagram. And you might remember from your early days in mathematics, and a Venn diagram would be, this is one group, this is another group, and then they overlap to share certain elements in between. And he said the one group is what you can do electronically, the other group is what you can do acoustically, and the overlap is much, much smaller amount that you can do that sounds good in both of those worlds. Right. And I think that that's the case. I mean, in a lot of, I've watched while, the string section of an orchestra, which used to be the backbone and the busiest part of the orchestra, and still is for people like John Williams, and it was for Jerry Goldsmith, and etc., has become relegated to holding pads while the percussion does all the propulsion. So the way a lot of composers write for an orchestra now is really based upon what they can make sound good on their electronics.
Right.
String pads sounded great on electronics, but if you wanted to have some like, just think about that great lick from Star Wars, that for in the early days you couldn't really get that sound because every every string sound would have a little crescendo in it, so it would come in softer and harder. So there's things that if you know how to write for an orchestra, that you can take advantage of that are very, very difficult to mock up. In fact, the only film that I did not do for pencil and paper was the last feature that I did, which was an hour documentary called The Automat. And that's the first time, I think, in the history of my writing that I did not do the score 100% on pencil and paper. Although I did lay out the cues and the little ideas, it was very sketchy, just enough information for me to do the mock-up right away because the director wanted to hear every cue. And I think it's a matter of, the days when John Williams would sit down at the piano with Steven Spielberg and say, these are my themes, those days are kind of gone. Most directors are expecting a full-fledged mock-up. And the sad thing about that is that a lot of times the director will hear an instrument and they go, what's that? And you say, it's a clarinet. It says, I don't like clarinet, don't use it. And they're making value judgments based upon electronic mock-ups as opposed to human live performances, which are so much more emotive.
Right.
So it's very frustrating. I mean, a number of years ago, well, it's got to be more than 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, a friend of mine who's a composer in Hollywood asked me if I could orchestrate something for him because he needed another set of hands. And I would get the cues and they would say, the cue number would be M23 version 7, V7. And I'd call up the music editor and say, how can there be 7 versions of this cue? I mean, I would slip my wrists if I had to write one cue 7 times. And he said, well, a lot of times it's just, the director comes over, doesn't like the flute sound, so the guy puts in an oboe sound that changes the version number, or he changes a percussion sound, or he changes one chord. I said, geez, that's rough. That's tough. I mean, the industry has really changed a lot. Mastering, making your mock-up sound as real as possible is great, but if you really understand how an orchestra works, your mock-ups can sound better. I mean, I remember for years, they would, all these electronic musician magazine and all these magazines would say, how to make your mock-up sound as real as possible. And the last thing that they would always say is, the more you understand and know about acoustic instruments, the better your mock-ups will sound. Because if you do things that it's not going to balance in an orchestra, it's not going to sound like a real orchestra.
Right. Can you explain to me what is the emotional depth level?
Well, one of the things that I teach when we're talking about film scoring is the policy of the score, how the score relates to the film. An emotional depth level is how much emotion do you want to put in it? Do you want to be very overtly pushing people's buttons, or do you want it to be a lot more subtle? If you think about things like Gone with the Wind, that love theme is gorgeous. Loris, is a beautiful theme, but it's really big and flowing. And if you did that on a contemporary love story, it would seem silly. So that has a very high emotional depth level as opposed to a much more low emotional depth level. Particularly, one of the examples would be in documentaries. Documentaries usually have a much shallower or emotional depth level because it would make them melodramatic. So sometimes it can be based upon, animation characters, classic animation characters like Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck. When they're sad, pull out the big minor chords, and it's it's kind of really on the nose. Whereas that's not necessarily the way you would do modern contemporary scoring. You wouldn't do that kind of huge depth level.
Yes, absolutely. One thing that's really great about the way you articulate and your ability is that also when you were working on the movie The Year of the Comet, the producers, or I believe Rob Reiner and the directors and the producers, they said, "Oh, we're going to get we were going to use the music by the Chieftains," and then you said, well, "Hold on a second, let me write you a theme, and then you can choose it, reject it if you like it or don't like it. But let me just write something first." And then you said you bought as many records as you could of the Chieftains, and you said, sitting there for hours trying to dissect their sound in order to come up with a theme that they might have liked, but was along that sort of language.
Yes. I mean, the interesting thing was that I ended up replacing another composer's score. And one of the things that I thought that the other composer had really left out was the idea that, music can help you with location. And since a lot of this, certainly the first part of the story starts in Scotland, It's like Celtic music would be a natural thing.
Yeah.
And then when Rob Reiner and Peter Yates, the director, were talking to me after they showed me the film, they brought up this idea of, buying a piece by the Chieftains. Now you need to have some explanation of that. They knew me mostly as Mark Shaman's conductor and orchestrator, so they didn't really know me as a composer. So they felt that that was kind of the safe thing to do. Is like, well, let's get something by the Chieftains that Hummie can base the theme on. And when they said that, my heart sank into my, just sank. I felt horrible, and I said, well, okay, I got to think fast on my feet if I'm gonna, save this and make this really a composition gig. And so I suggested to them that if they give me the weekend, exactly like you said, I can come up with something. If they don't like it, then they can always go buy something from the Chieftains. But I also pointed out to them that I'd probably be saving them between $25,000 and $50,000, which, since I was the second composer on the film, had already cost them a lot of money. So I went away again and did exactly what you said. I listened to the Chieftains, tried to kind of suss out what it is that made the Chieftains sound like the Chieftains, and that's what I put into my piece. So I used penny whistle, I used bodhran, and I used hammered dulcimer, along with an orchestra. But I also, the types of harmonies I did, the types of melodies, all of those aspects were things that I tried to suss out what it was the Chieftains did. But the other thing is also that when you're writing a theme for a film, you also have to make sure that it's going to work in the various scenarios that it's going to have to support. So the main theme that in the film is called Maggie Goes to Scotland. And that's when she goes to Scotland and she's introduced to the country for the first time. And then it becomes her love theme. Well, they're going to have completely different emotional contexts. And so you have to make sure that the theme is workable with both of those contexts. So even though my music is Celtic flavored, it's not pure Celtic. Because I also have to be able to manipulate it to fulfill other requirements in the movie. So it really is the art form of film scoring is, what I usually explain to it is just themes and variations. And the dramatic variations are like, a happy person. You may have a theme for a character named Sally, and maybe she's happy, and then you have to play her very sad. Well, those would be themes that would be related to each other. They wouldn't be completely different pieces of music. And usually, the way I teach it is that it would be, Sally's happy theme would have a similar melody to Sally's sad theme, but the texture and the harmonization of Sally's sad theme and the tempo and the instrumentation would be very different. I mean, a really good example of that, if everybody wants to go check it out, is go watch the first 20 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you'll notice that the first time that we hear Indiana Jones's theme, ba-ba-da-dum, is when he's running away from the Aboriginal soldiers. And then if you watch from that point on for another 10 minutes, you'll hear 5 or 6 different dramatic variations of the theme. He's brilliant. He's kind of one of the people that I learned from in terms of watching.
You are both a composer, a great composer and a great orchestrator. Are the two jobs completely different, or does the composer compose? What I'm trying to say is, are these really so different in terms of their skill sets, or is there overlap? Sometimes I've heard that sometimes a composer just writes the theme and gives it to the orchestrator, and sometimes the orchestrator does a tremendous amount of the work that shapes the overall sound, almost to the point that he really should be credited. But on the flip side, sometimes I've also read that composers are very particular about where they want certain things, and such that they almost give you a fleshed out theme. So it's not that much that you have to do. So I just would love your perspective on that, the two things.
Yeah, both of those exist. I mean, Ennio Morricone, who orchestrates all of his own music, says, you're not really done if you don't orchestrate. Classical composers have orchestrated their own music forever. That's part of the skill set. It's only, become something where in film music, and we should be, somewhat honest about it. When I'm orchestrating for someone, I give them exactly what they gave me back, but then I look for opportunities to add things, and adding a cymbal roll here or a glockenspiel hit there, or like the idea of the bassoon in the piece for Dying Young for James Newton Howard. The fact is that there's a lot of orchestrators that just transcribe whatever was in the synths and don't make any changes, and don't they figure if they give back the composer what they wrote, then that's fine. And the composer that's working electronically is never going to do like a very minor version of things because they have to get approval. So they're not going to do something only on piano and say it'll sound bigger with the orchestra, which John Williams would have done all the time because he doesn't mock things up. So I'm imagining he doesn't mock things up. I mean, I don't know this for certain, but I'm kind of imagining that he was fortunate enough to have the kind of trust that people went. When Steven Spielberg called him up, he knows that if he hears his themes, they're going to sound great with the orchestra. So I've orchestrated for both kinds of people. People that give me complete sketches, and sometimes they're 7-line sketches or 9-line sketches or 11-line sketches where the piece is completely laid out. And then I've been given things where here's a lead sheet and make it sound big.
Right.
I mean, the thing that's interesting is that every composer works differently, and that's not to say that it's not a valid way of working. I mean, you just have to look at the quality of music that Jerry Goldsmith, John Williams was writing, and what some of the contemporary guys are doing. Some of them are doing a great job of it, and some of them are not.
Right.
I mean, I think the thing that's interesting is that electronics made it possible for people who don't read a note of music to score films. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? It depends on the individual. There's guys who can do that and have a really good flair and a really good dramatic sense, and there's people who don't. So it's hard to say base it on what one's skill set is as much as it is their dramatic sensibility and their musicality. I mean, do I care if Paul McCartney reads music? No, I don't care if he orchestrates either. Because he's such a great songwriter and a great melodist. So it's a very interesting situation that we have now, where people who have very little musical training but have done it, and I don't mean they've done it as a hobby. I mean, a lot of major rock acts, the best they do is just chord changes over the lyrics, and that's that they figure out the songs together.
Right.
And that doesn't make it bad music. Sometimes it's some of the best music.
I'd like to talk about, for instance, like let's take the horror genre. So you have, I guess, in the 18th century with Mozart, what would have been terrifying would have been kind of would not work. Maybe would not be the same sort of thing today. But then we have the music from The Exorcist. We have Bernard Herrmann from Psycho. And then we have the atonal music from the Second Viennese School. So if somebody asked you, I need a horror score, what would be your frame of reference, and like how much would it be you, and how much would it be just you basing? Is it always based off the film? So, but then again, yes. I mean, I watched The Witch with Robert Egg, who was directed by Robert Eggers. It had very dissonant strings on it. And so, like, what are your, obviously you have a bunch of options. How would you, if you were put in that situation, how would you kind of find your ideal solution?
I mean, basically and this is what I call the vocabulary of the score, is you choose what are going to be the elements of the score. Obviously, if it's a horror film, the use of dissonance is going to be profound and pronounced. You might come up with some harmonic system that you create that is just different levels of dissonance. There's lots of ways of doing that. You may decide to do something. The go-to stuff is definitely going to be dissonance and some aleatoric techniques. Things like quarter note bending, free bending quarter note pitches on the strings, things of that sort. I think that the king of that kind of stuff is probably Chris Young. He's done a lot of that kind of stuff, and I've conducted a couple scores for Chris, and he's, he does a lot of dissonant things where he'll take an F minor chord of an E bass. So you have this dissonant interval between the E and the F of a flat 9, which is a very highly dissonant interval. So the idea of controlling dissonances, when to relax those dissonances, might be to a minor chord, might be to a structure that doesn't, some structure in fourths that doesn't have as much clarity in terms of tonality. So there's all kinds of ways of tools. Probably, those would be the main go-to things that I would use. And also 20th century techniques. I mean, there's 20th century techniques that are great where you give a figure and say play as fast as possible, or just improvise on these notes, and you get these clouds of sound that are really fantastic. I think that film music makes it's interesting. I think film music makes a lot of those kind of dissonant and aleatoric techniques very comfortable for an audience because they're expecting that kind of sound.
Yes.
They may not be big fans of Ligeti or the guys who wrote that kind of concert music, but they'll totally buy it when it's in a film score.
Yeah, that's such a profound point that you just made, because I think a lot of people say, "Oh, I love listening to Mozart, but I hate all this modern stuff." And then when it's in a film, they'll listen to it all day. So it's really interesting that how the little tweak of the setting changes everything.
Well, it supports the emotion that they're feeling. They're scared. They want to be put on edge. Music can do that really well, but that's not the kind of stuff that they want to listen for concert music. I mean, even to today, I mean, those 20th century composers that wrote in that style don't get a lot of concertizing. They're studied in schools, but I don't think 12-tone music gets performed much.
Now you are well known for your work on Robin Hood Men in Tights, and it's interesting. You've mentioned that there's kind of two ways to write comedic music. One is kind of like the old Looney Tunes way, which is just kind of following the scene, and then the way is, as you said, just playing it straight in a way, just and then letting that almost be as the straight man to the absurdity on the screen.
Right.
Could you comment on that, and cause how did you do research for that undertaking, and how did you prepare to make the score for that?
Okay. Well, first of all, Mel basically chose the policy of the score for me. He said, "I don't want funny music."
Okay.
He said, I want the music to be swashbuckling, Korngoldian, and big adventure music." And so what I did is when I got hired for the film, I went out and bought videos of all the Robin Hood movies I could find, and I listened to what was the history of Robin Hood music. Some of the music was really helpful, and some of it was not helpful at all. But so I had to come up with my own language of what I was going to do, and I wanted it to sound like the Knights and the swashbuckling score. And it was an interesting process with Mel, because before he hired me, he said, "Well, I want you to write a Robin Hood theme for me." And I came back and I had written a theme that he didn't like, and he said, "Well, go write another one. That one's not floating my boat," which is okay. That's it's his movie. And then I came back with the bum 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 ba da dum da the fanfare-ish one, and he loved that. And then the other thing that I did is I'd written the Marion theme, but I had put some lyrics to it because somebody had told me, if you put lyrics to your themes, Mel will like them more. You think he's a songwriter primarily. He's a very talented man, and he writes a lot of songs. So I came up with "Where is the one that I love most of all? When will I hear him call Marion, Marion?" And then Mel decided to add more lyrics to the theme, and which I musically composed already. And then it became a scene in the movie that was not in the original script. And so he loved that. So there were different elements of different themes, obviously. And then there was the Korngoldian, what I call my Korngoldian theme, which is after the fanfare in the main title. So it was interesting because Mel didn't want me to use that theme. Oh, and then there was a procession. Bum, 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 ba-dum, dum. And so Mel liked the fanfare, the procession, and Marion's theme, and said he didn't want me to use the other theme. And I said, I need to use the other theme because, it's the most Korngoldian theme that I've written. And after the film was scored, he actually agreed with me. He said, "Yes, you were right." So that was nice.
I have a question. You mentioned, you said you bought Robin Hood and that sort of thing. Okay, I have a question about how you break down things. So, do you have perfect pitch? So when you hear things, you can quickly, you know what pitches they are. Do you have very highly developed relative pitch? Or do you also supplement that by, is this a thing? Do people buy scores? Are there scores in Hollywood that you can go and buy from famous films?
Very few. There's now a publishing company that has released some contemporary ones, but you can't get the scores to those films. I have very, very, very good relative pitch. Like I can hear something and play it back, but I don't necessarily play it back in the same key. So what I'm listening for is the types of melodies, the types of harmonies. You know, is there any specific instrumentation that's being taken advantage of? So I'm listening to what are the elements of the score, what is the vocabulary of the score that they're using, and how this score relates to the picture. You know, I mean, one of the things about Robin Hood is there's no funny music. If you listen to the actual soundtrack,
Yeah.
well, I take that back. There's one moment of funny music, but actually, I don't even know if that one moment is on the soundtrack. But in the film, there's one moment of funny music, but it made sense, and Mel liked it, luckily. But the thing that makes the music work against the comedy is that sometimes the way it synchronizes with the comedy, with the action on screen, makes it more ludicrous. So
Yeah.
I'm playing it serious, but what's going on screen is kind of silly. So that's one of the ways, yeah, because you were right. There's two ways of scoring a film. You either funny comedies, you have funny music, like wah 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 when someone falls down the stairs, you know, or you don't play the funny music.
Right, right. This really impressed me. This is an epic anecdote that you should share, and I love this. This is talking about Barbara Streisand's arrangement that you had to come in at like the some ridiculous hour, and there's a full orchestra waiting, just sitting there, and you had with your friend you had to fix an arrangement because Barbara Streisand didn't like the arrangement. You have to share that anecdote. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, so there's a couple of stories that are part of that story. So Barbara Streisand was the director of oh God, what's the name of the movie? Hang on, I can't blank out of this. Prince of Tides, thank you. So Barbara Streisand was the director of Prince of Tides. James Newton Howard was scoring it. And at the end of the night, they had this 85-piece orchestra. Barbara Streisand did not like the arrangement that was written. And so the first called orchestrator, the lead orchestrator, was Brad Dector, who's a good friend of mine. And Brad and I had worked with each other on a lot of projects when he was working with something with James Newton Howard, you know, and he needed a hand, he'd call me. If I was doing something for Mark Shaman and I needed a hand, I'd call him. And in fact, I had orchestrated one cue on Prince of Tides because because I got a call from Brad and he said that he wasn't feeling well and he really needed to sleep because he was so under the gun. So I said, sure, I'll do this last cue for you, no problem. And I didn't bother going to the recording session, which usually orchestrators would go because I figured one cue, you know, what can go wrong, right?
Yep.
So I'm going to tell the whole anecdote because the whole anecdote's funny. So I walk into the studio and Brad turns to the head copyist and says, should we tell him? And the head copyist says, oh, I don't know. That might not be a good idea. And I'm going, my orchestration must have been a train wreck, right? And Brad turns to me, he says, I hate your guts. And I said, why do you hate my guts? What's the matter? He said, I've been in here all week, and every single cue that we've done, Barbara said, oh, can we take the flute line out and put an oboe line in? And can we take the clarinet line and put it on French horn? And every single cue, there was some adjustment, which is fine. You know, she's very knowledgeable, and she knows what she wants. And so nobody questioned that of her. But, you know, that was just kind of part of the game, part of the situation when you're working with Barbara Streisand, is she's going to make recommendations or she's going to want to try stuff. So Brad, they played on the one orchestration that I did. Brad turns to Barbara and Barbara says, that one's perfect. And Brad, which is just, you know, it's just a lucky chance. You know, I'm not like way more gifted than Brad. I think Brad's way more gifted than me in orchestration. I've learned a lot from Brad. But it was like just funny. So anyway, that night, you know, I got into the studio because Brad called me and told me about this problem that Barbara didn't like this chart. So I'm at MGM in West LA. We're at the studio at MGM or 20th Century. No, it's 20th Century Fox. I'm trying to envision a studio. It was one of those two. And I get there and I come in and Brad's got the original arrangement. And he's sitting there with score paper and he's doing the strings and the strings in the rhythm section, and he's handing it to me, and I'm having to write woodwind, or he's doing strings and brass, I'm doing woodwinds and percussion and rhythm section, or somehow we broke it up by section, and we're sharing one keyboard in between the two of us. Rewrite this chart while the entire 85-piece orchestra is sitting there, and then at some point, about 20 minutes later, we hear word that Barbara wanted a bigger string section, so they called in another 20 violinists to show up at 10 o'clock at night to record this thing. So there's this 105-piece orchestra, or some huge orchestra, waiting to play this piece that Brad and I are working on. And I'm sitting there and I'm scribbling, and Brad's sitting there scribbling. And I'll never forget this. Barbara Streisand came in, put her hands on my shoulders, and said, "How do you guys do this so fast?" We're just trying to make the best of the situation, Barbara. So,
that's very epic. Incredible.
It's a great Hollywood story.
It's so epic. Okay. I have a question about your rig. If you don't mind me sharing, what your preferences are in terms of studio equipment at your own home.
My rig is primarily for doing mock-ups. I don't really do much stuff that goes to air that I've done. I mean, I've done a couple, but not very many. So my rig is a much smaller rig than most guys. And nowadays it's even smaller because most of it lives in a couple of computers. I have a main computer, which is a Mac, and I'm using Digital Performer because Digital Performer in my mind has the best film mathematic capability. You can print out, if you're scoring something live, you can print out something with streamers and clicks, which you can't do on any other DAW. You can't overlay the streamers, and you can add the clicks, but you can't overlay streamer, which, if you're going to do anything free timing or anything with retards, is kind of important. I mean, it's an interesting thing because that's one of the things that has been lost with people working electronically, is that the whole breathing of music, of having stuff that has retards and accelerandos, has mostly disappeared. People will work with a fixed tempo for a whole piece. Not that that's bad, but it's just kind of an element of music that's kind of disappearing. So my one computer is connect by an Ethernet cable to a PC. That's where I keep all my sounds, and I'm using Vienna Ensemble Pro, which allows the two computers to talk to each other. And then I just have bunches of libraries. I'm embarrassed to say that gear talk has become less interesting to me over the years. I own some Vienna stuff. I own a bunch. I'd have to look it up if you want to.
Yeah.
So I have an entire exterior drive that just has nothing but samples in it.
How big is that hard drive?
4 terabytes, I think it is.
Okay.
So, I use East-West libraries. I like a lot of my basic stuff is on East-West libraries. So I use East-West Hollywood Brass, East-West Hollywood Orchestral Percussion, East-West Hollywood Strings, East-West Hollywood Symphonic Orchestra, which is the predecessor. So I have pretty much the entire East-West East-West Hollywood series. And then they have a new set that it must live in another drive, it must live on another place. My orchestral stuff. I still have some stuff from Giga Studio, but that's kind of, I don't have a Giga Studio setup anymore. I have a plugin, which is a little bit touchy. I have some of the Vienna Ensemble Pro stuff. I have the Wallander instruments.
Note Performer?
Yeah, well, the Note Performer is attached to Finale or Sibelius, but I also have the standalone software, so I can use that. And then Vienna Ensemble has the VSL Synchron series, and I have some of those, and those Epic Orchestra. So I don't have as many as a lot of people have. I used to have a lot, but I have a lot of things, but like I have Omnisphere, which is a great electronic sounding stuff. I have Sample Tank, which has a lot of interesting sounds, but you have to kind of dig around them. Sample Tank 4. I would say that you need to buy a pretty decent set of acoustic samples. It used to be that everybody, for a long time, the top of the game was the Vienna Ensemble Cube, I think they called it. and it was a real fortune. And nowadays you can buy all of the Hollywood, the you can buy all of the East West libraries, the Hollywood libraries, and they're great. And the synchron libraries are some of them are some of them are in there also. So those would be, you need some acoustic stuff. I try to do when I'm doing electronic score to be truly electronic, and to use stuff that's sound designy, and those are from all over the place. But Omnisphere is probably one of my main sources of that stuff.
Do
And then
you?
battery.
Oh, go ahead.
I mean, a bunch of the contact stuff. Let me see. So contact libraries. I have a bunch of the contact libraries, but I'd have to open my DAW in order to get them up, and I'm concerned that I'll mess up our connection here.
Yeah, no problem. Do you mix and master in Pro Tools or in Digital Performer, or what is your choice for mixing?
Well, again, if I'm only doing demos, I do everything in Digital Performer.
Okay.
If I'm doing something that actually, I mean, for instance, when I did the score to In Cold Blood, which is electronics and the guitar and dobro, I recorded all of the individual synth sounds onto a DA88. So I had 8 tracks. And then I brought that to Capitol Records. They were transferred to a 24-track machine, and then we added the guitars. Or I think we were still working on tape back then, but maybe it was transferred into Pro Tools. So I don't try to do final mixing in my studio. I mean, I do a decent mixing, but again, very little stuff goes from my studio onto the air.
Okay.
I mean, I'm very, very, very fortunate that I work most of the time with people that want to spend the money on live musicians.
Right.
I mean, there's guys who do electronic emulation much better than I do. So, if I really needed to do something that was fully electronic, I probably would still write out scores and hand it off to somebody else who's a much better mock-up artist than I am.
And do you use scoring software, or do you write out? Do you use like Finale, Sibelius? I don't know if you just mentioned it. I might have missed that. Just Sibelius, Dorico, Finale.
I'm a Finale user.
Okay.
And I do when I'm composing, I do mostly pencil and paper. If I'm going, like I said, the last film that I did, which was the first time I had ever done this, I did not do anything. I never created a score. The scores were all created by my orchestrators, printing out my files and then applying the same principle that I tell them to apply, which is bring something to the party that I can erase in one simple command. So every now and then I'd be conducting something, or I'd be hearing something, and there's a sax voice, and I went, oh, that's pretty cool. And sometimes I went, no, I don't want that in there, and I'd tell the player not to play. So I did exactly the kind of stuff that Jerry Goldsmith and James Newton Howard did, which is, oh, I like that. No, I don't like that, and that's okay. I mean, I want to know that my orchestrators are thinking coloristically in moments where I may not have, or not have done as much as could have done.
Okay. Time to end off with some fun questions. So these are going to be some quick, and you don't have to give like super detailed answers, just whatever comes to mind. Or you can just dive in if you feel it needs to be elaborated on. So first question, what was the most fun project to do?
Well, that's a tough question. That's like asking which is your favorite child, which is a question you never ask anybody. I think that one of the scores that I had a good time doing was I did a film called Woolly Boys, which is kind of a bluegrass score, and I got to play guitar on it, and that was very exciting. It was a very small ensemble. It was like 6 musicians, and I was one of them. That was a lot of fun. A lot of pressure, but a lot of fun.
No, by contrast, what was the most difficult score in terms of, not so up to you how you want to define that, but like perhaps effort, perhaps choice of notes? What was the most difficult score to work on?
Yeah, I mean, there was a score that'll go nameless where the director was really in a bad mood. It had nothing to do with me, but he wasn't a lot of fun to be around. So, and when he would call me up, he would be yelling at me, and I'd just go, "Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do anything wrong," So, that was a tough one. But in terms of actually coming up with a concept, the very, very first score I did was for a movie called Stooge Mania, which is about a guy who hallucinates about Stooge being in three Stooges movies. And the director wanted me to base the entire score on 3 blind mice. That was a challenge. And after he heard the score, he said, yeah, that wasn't a good idea. And it's like, yeah, but it was because it was my first score. I didn't feel that I could tell them no. You know?
Right, right, right.
I've since learned not to let anybody else make decisions about what I'm doing creatively except me, because no one else is going to see that movie and go, "Oh, why is this score so bad?" you know, I don't think it was a horrible score, but it's just like it certainly wasn't the most creative score.
Favorite instrument or section in the orchestra?
Oh, well, the strings are the favorite section, but if I had to single out one instrument, I'd have to say it's oboe. And not only that, but my students tease me because I have a favorite note on the oboe.
And what is that?
The high D, 2 ledger lines above the staff. If I'm going to write an oboe solo, I always try to make that the top note.
First, I'm going to ask about other people's scores, and then I'm going to ask about yours. So, what are if somebody asks, what are the top 3 film scores?
Oh, that's easy. Basic Instinct by Jerry Goldsmith, Ennio Morricone for the Cinema Paradiso, and John Williams for. Can I name more than 3?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, John Williams for Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Thomas Newman for Shawshank Redemption. I could listen to those 4 scores and never listen to anything else.
I got to ask you to maybe just add a little bit more elaboration for why for each, because that's made me curious.
Wow. Basic Instinct has just got the most amazing angular melodic part to it, and this incredible harmonic language that Jerry kind of came up with. I think that Ennio Morricone writes, that movie has more stunning themes than any movie should ever be allowed. I mean, they're just so musical and just so. I cry when I listen to those themes. I'd love to write one of those themes. I think Raiders of the Lost Ark is without question in my mind one of the great American film scores, and the technique is incredible, and just how John Williams uses his themes and varies them, and it's just his craftsmanship is just incredible, and he's so musical and he's so incredible. I mean, I don't even know if there's enough good words to say. And Thomas Newman in Shawshank Redemption kind of recreated music for me. I mean, the language, the harmonic language, and what he did there was just so fresh and so wonderful that I listen to that score all the time. I mean, when I misplaced one of my copy, the CD copy, I immediately went to the record store and bought another CD copy, so I made sure that I have one before they were unavailable anymore. so I have 2 copies.
Now that you say that, now that I'm thinking about the music, I mean, it's such an incredible movie just to begin with. That scene where it's raining and he's about to bust out of the prison, harmonically, now that I'm thinking, yeah, there's a lot of interesting. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting score. Really interesting. Do you have any parts of that score that you want to single out that are harmonically, any cues that you really think are cool that people should check out?
Well, the opening is incredible itself, where he has this repeating bass ostinato thing going on. I don't know. To point out one section would be, I mean, there's a cue that's called Brooks Was Here. Brooks was here, where we're in the room where Brooks hung himself, and he sees this carving on the wall. Brooks was here. It's just it's so amazing. So
okay, so now if somebody wanted to listen to the music of Hummie Mann, what would it's very difficult if you're a film composer because you do so many projects. So, but maybe could you recommend 5 scores? It doesn't have to be film also. It could be television. It could be other media. What would you give to a new listener of your work?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned is that I like to do variety of things and different styles. So I would probably bring out things that are different, rather different. So Robin Hood Men in Tights, probably my best known score. Dracula Dead and Loving It is a completely different kind of language. At one point, I got contacted by Michael Schell, who found me online, and he told me that he uses one of my scores to teach in his composition classes. And I asked what score, and he said Dracula Dead and Loving It, the main title in particular. And it turns out that he himself is a Pulitzer-nominated composer, so I was quite honored. So those two scores. Language of the Heart was a piece that was kind of a violin concerto that a lot of people love, and I won an Emmy Award for that one. In Cold Blood is probably my most different score that's easily available. There's a CD of it, where it's a kind of a combination of Ry Cooder meets electronic cold horror stuff. A lot of it's ambient and textural, which is not the thing that most people know me for. That's 4, and probably I would say there's a new soundtrack coming out for the Automat, and that's kind of 1940s style of writing. Or I would say go look for Thomas and the Magic Railroad, which is a kids movie, which I'm very proud of the score.
I was gonna just ask you about that because I was just thinking I can't because there's a lot of people who are fans of that, and there's only one video of you talking about it on YouTube. And so I think people are saying, "Oh, thank goodness, there's one interview of this guy on YouTube." But there's people really that music resonated with a lot of people. So just before we end the interview, could you just talk a little bit about that? You used the word magic, the Magic Railroad. It was a magical score as well. So just talk about working on that and maybe something that would delight the people who love that series.
It was a series that my kids grew up on, and so I was very familiar with the characters in the series. And there's kind of a story about that I was in LA trying to reach the director, the production office, and I kept calling and calling and calling. I put my phone on auto recall and finally got through. And I said, they picked a composer. I'm a composer. And the person on the other end of the phone said, "Well, the director is actually in Los Angeles interviewing composers this week." And I went, "Oh, is there any way that I can get some material to her?" And she puts me on hold and says, "Well, if you want to run some material over to her house in Santa Monica, she'll give it a listen." So I ran some stuff over and I dropped it off. And it took me about 40 minutes to get back to my office. And in that 40 minutes, she had enough time to listen to the stuff that she called me and said, "Come back, I want to meet with you." And so, I was able to talk about the characters in the movie. I was able to, I didn't even know anything about the movie or what characters was in it, but I just, knew about Thomas, Mr. Conductor. And so I ended up, we had a great conversation, and the next morning I got hired. I mean, I think that that score was a lot of fun to do. And, so just, I got to write 3 songs for the movie.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm very proud of that score. One of the things that's interesting is you're talking about it being very popular is that if you go into YouTube and you search Thomas and the Magic Railroad, there's one piece of the video that's on YouTube that includes the score for the section for the chase sequence. And that piece has had 34 million views.
That's right.
Unbelievable.
I just want to extend my thanks to you, Hummie, for taking the time out and being so generous with your time and just sharing your experience and your expertise. You're a great teacher, you're a great composer, and you do so many things at a top level. And it's just great to be able to talk to you and to have this opportunity to speak with you. Could you mention upcoming projects, anything you would like to plug or mention to end off the show?
Well, it's interesting. I'm having a very busy period of life right now. I've been hired to score an 8-episode podcast about the Misty Poets in China, which is a very interesting story of these people who were during the Cultural Revolution were meeting and advancing art forms and advancing things that would have been illegal under the Chinese regime. So that's a very interesting piece. I have another feature documentary, which is the history of women, which is the history of the world, but all the achievements of women. And finally, it's not a big project, but it's big project for me. My daughter, who's a choreographer, producer, she wears a lot of hats, is producing a show about Van Helsing, Dracula.
Right.
So I'm getting to revisit Dracula again. I've been asked to write the music, which I was very honored to have my daughter ask me to do that. So that's another project I have coming up. Beyond that, who knows?
Great.
Hopefully, I'll get the book finished, and
Yeah. So when I was researching the interview, it was like 2017 or something. You were mentioning that you had announced the book. So what is the update on the book?
The book is currently 300 pages long in its first draft, and I need to go back through and kind of clean it up and put some more musical examples in it. So it's got probably another year's worth of work. I mean, just so everybody understands this is all the techniques that we teach in the Pacific Northwest Film Scoring program the master's program that I created that's at the Seattle Film Institute. So it's kind of been student tested, and we know it works, and that these techniques, are valuable tools for students and help them understand. Again, I always make this analogy that if I put a cup of coffee between you and me, and we're sitting at opposite ends of the table, we both know it's a cup of coffee, but we're looking at it from 180 degrees difference. So I'm going to teach techniques that it's something that you might hear in a John Williams score or a Jerry Goldsmith score. I don't necessarily care that Jerry or John thought of it that way, but I care that you now have the skill set of creating that sound.
Wonderful. Well, we're looking forward to the book, and it's definitely going to be a great educational resource. So the great Hummie Mann, thank you so much, sir, for being on the show, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate it, and I hope a lot of listeners gain something from this. So that's great.